Europe is self-destructing for what? To fight a proxy war against Russia that is motivated by this Cold War ideology. I want to say these ancient hatreds, because, what are they supporting? They're supporting this like 1930s, 1940s ideology in Ukraine that still glorifies Stepan Bandera, the Hitler accomplice who helped commit genocide against Jews and Poles. That's what they're fighting for. That's their European values that they're prepared to destroy their economy for, freeze people to death in the winter.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. Since February 24th, the West has been unwilling to acknowledge the NATO provocations that laid the ground for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the groupthink has only gotten worse. As they pour an endless amount of weapons into Ukraine to bleed the Russians, our leaders are very casually setting us up for a potential nuclear showdown that would be catastrophic for humanity. Anyone who speaks out against this insanity or advocates diplomacy to avoid nuclear Armageddon is labeled a Putin apologist, a Kremlin agent, a Russian propagandist. In the meantime, Europe continues to slit its own throat as sanctions on Russia destroy its economy and cause gas shortages, while European leaders and media demonstrate shocking levels of racism and hypocrisy. To help make sense of it all, I'm joined by Ali Abunimah, Executive Director of the Electronic Intifada and author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews or by donating below on YouTube. Ali, welcome back to the show.
It's always a pleasure, Rania.
It really is like all my pleasure, I should say, to have you on. I always had such a great time chatting with you. And I feel like it's become a regular thing every couple of months. Like we have to discuss all the new developments in the world, whether it's about Palestine or in this case, Ukraine. But, right now, I think we're in a really strange and alarming situation because the world is hearing, real serious talk of nuclear retaliation and escalation coming from these high level officials in Washington for, the first time in many years, many decades. And it feels like, the idea of nuclear Armageddon, I mean, it's not likely, but it's more likely. And that makes it a real danger. And these officials just keep like casually mentioning it like it's no big deal. And the argument we keep, getting is that, we have to save the West and we have to save Ukraine. And that might require some sort of like nuclear, strike. But if there were a nuclear attack, there would be no Ukraine left. And furthermore, like the rest of the world would be made unlivable. And we can get into that. But I just want to note a couple of things here before I get your take on this. The former defense secretary and CIA director, Leon Panetta, even was on television recently and cited intelligence analysts who believe the probability of nuclear weapons use in Ukraine has risen from 1 to 5% at the start of the war to 20 to 25% today. I don't know who comes up with those calculations and how, but even 1% is disturbing, let alone 25%. And then you have Biden calling the prospect of nuclear Armageddon the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and on and on and on. I mean, I could go on listing all of the comments that we've been hearing just in the last month that nobody seems to be really taking seriously. But before we get into what a nuclear war would actually look like, what do you make of the way these officials are so cavalierly like walking us into potential nuclear confrontation with their proxy war in Ukraine?
Well, it's horrifying. And what I find horrifying about it, Rania, is that, yes, Biden used the word Armageddon, but for the most part, people aren't talking about Armageddon. They're talking about nuclear weapons as if, it's just some kind of like bigger bomb. And, I'm old enough to remember, I grew up in the 1980s when the fear of nuclear Armageddon was real. And it was understood universally that nuclear war meant the end of the world. And the term that we talked about, that everyone knew at the time was nuclear winter. That, even if you survived the initial horrifying nuclear holocaust, the world would quickly be enveloped because there would be so much, ash and debris thrown up into the atmosphere. The world would cool. It would be thrown into a nuclear winter where nothing could survive, where the survivors would be, they'd starve to death if they even survived. So it was understood that nuclear war was something to be avoided at all costs because it meant the end of the world. Nobody joked about it. Nobody took risks about it. I think there was a historical proximity. When we're talking about the 80s, it was 40 years ago almost, the mid 80s. And that was the same distance from today. We're the same distance from the mid 80s as we were in the mid 80s from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we were much closer to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was only 20 years or so, 25 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think the consciousness was much higher. And what I find as someone who lived in that era, and I'm not that old, and it's like these world leaders a lot of them are older than me, so they ought to know this stuff, that, it's not just 12-year-old think tankers that are, it's like grown men and women who are talking this way. So I'm just utterly horrified by it. The one caveat is that throughout history, the only power that has actually used nuclear weapons, of course, we know is the United States, but it's also the power that has repeatedly contemplated using them again. We know that the US wanted to use them against China. They talked about using them in Korea. And even in the 80s, there was this idea, it was actually an older American idea, of so-called limited nuclear war in Europe. And it was, as I remember, I'm talking about when I was a teenager, so, the historians who watch your show can correct me. But that idea of limited nuclear war and the way American officials or American intellectuals or whatever you want to call them talked about, we could fight a nuclear war that would be limited to the European continent, was part of what drove the massive anti-nuclear movements in Europe. You had these massive movements in Germany, in Britain, the women's movement, they were called the Greenham Common Women. This was a woman-led movement against American nuclear weapons in the UK. You had in Germany the anti-nuclear movement, and this succeeded. It created enough pressure that eventually the US and the Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which removed these so-called medium-range nuclear missiles from the European continent. And ultimately, through the 80s, the reduction in nuclear weapons, don't get me wrong, there's still thousands of warheads that could destroy the planet dozens of times over. But there was the removal of these sort of shorter range weapons that had an even shorter flying time, that the world would be destroyed in 3 minutes or whatever it was. And I feel like all that history and consciousness is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And, for Vladimir Zelensky to actually call for preemptive strikes on Russia would have been unthinkable. And we're not talking about, peaceniks. We're talking about the Reagan administration, but even they did not joke about nuclear war. And there was a notorious incident in 1983 called Abel Archer. This was a NATO exercise that was a large-scale NATO exercise, and the Soviet intelligence were picking up the preparations for Abel Archer, and they thought that this was the real thing. They thought that NATO was preparing for a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. And so they were in the position of having to decide whether the Soviet Union should have to strike first. And so that episode or that incident is less known than the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Abel Archer is said to be, there's a new book out about Abel Archer that I haven't actually read yet, but from my recollection, Abel Archer was one of the impetuses, along with, it's said that the movie The Day After, I don't know if you remember that, you're probably too young for that, but I'll get to that in a second. But that was one of the impetuses that pushed Ronald Reagan to, take seriously nuclear reduction and even to contemplate the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, and by the way, there's a really good, I don't know if it's still available, but there was a really good Hulu series a few years ago called Deutschland 83. I mean, I think it's a German-made series. It's a fictional drama, but it's set around the events of Abel Archer, and it actually manages to be really funny. I mean, it's kind of dark humor, but it's actually well worth watching. But the other thing I remember from the 80s was this sort of terrible made-for-TV movie called The Day After. And it was shown all over the world. It was shown across the United States. It was shown in Europe. I don't know if it was shown, I can't remember if it was shown in the Soviet Union. That's something I need to look up. But it was like this TV movie that showed the aftermath of a nuclear war, basically. And, basically it's like the end of the world. The few survivors are like scrambling around in the ruins waiting for their flesh to fall off. And I mean, the point of the film was to tell people, like, there's no surviving nuclear war.
Right.
And I remember that film was terrifying. It was really terrifying because this wasn't just entertainment. It wasn't just like, watching a Halloween movie. This was like what the world was possibly facing unless the course was changed. So for me, for someone of that generation, I just can't take talk of nuclear war casually. And that's why I, I'm horrified by this and I talk about it, because it's just, that's what we're talking about. And we've already got enough like potentially world-ending
right.
things going on at the moment. We don't need this.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if part of the difference, at least in terms of the ability to get people worried about an apocalypse, is there was this like apocalypse genre that was almost overdone the last 20 years. There's like a million movies similar to like The Day After, like a zombie apocalypse, a climate change apocalypse, a tsunami apocalypse, a nuclear apocalypse, and on and on and on, that people just don't even, they're like numb to the idea. But just to reinforce what you're talking about here, I want to show some stuff from this article. I'm just showing the headline right now, but it's important because this is a piece in Live Science that basically explains the reality of nuclear war, right? So you have the headline, nuclear winter from a US-Russia conflict would wipe out 63% of the world's population. I'm just going to read a few sentences here because we don't hear this. This is not, the CNN isn't telling you this. And I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but more than 5 billion people, roughly 63% of the world's current population, would die of famine in the aftermath of a full-scale nuclear war between the US, Russia, and their allies. According to the researchers, the conflict would create widespread fires that could eject up to 160 million tons of soot into the Earth's atmosphere, leading to crop declines in the food exporting US and Russia that would send global calorie production plummeting by as much as 90%. Now, the reason I think that this didn't get so much attention, this study that I'm speaking of, is this particular part. In a US-Russia nuclear war, more people would die from famine in India and Pakistan alone than in the countries actually fighting the war. So because when we talk about the aftermath of a nuclear war, there would be what you called a nuclear winter that would lead to basically like no food for anyone. You wouldn't be able to grow food. And I think there's a mentality perhaps in certain rich countries that maybe they wouldn't be the ones who'd have to deal with the aftermath of that, even though that's not even really true. But I just wanted to note that to reinforce like how drastic the consequence of this would be. But go ahead, if you want to add to that, go ahead.
It's not, I mean, I hadn't seen this article. In a way, I'm glad to see it. But the point, that was in Live Science, and, it was kind of a marginal thing. But the point I'm making is that at least in the so-called West, the term nuclear winter was as current in the 1980s as the term global warming is now. I mean, that's the point I'm making. The consciousness of the world-ending consequences of nuclear war was at the top of everyone's mind. You didn't have to go, well, I mean, there were no websites, obviously, then. We had rotary telephones. But, the point I'm making is that was the common fear. And it wasn't like something like, okay, so global warming is bad enough and, we see the disaster, but it's a slow motion calamity. The point about nuclear war is the world is over in 5 minutes, and the point of miscalculation was the really terrifying thing, because, this whole concept of mutually assured destruction, that the only way to prevent nuclear war was to convince your adversary that if they launched a strike at you, you would launch a strike back at them and everyone would be dead, right? Obviously, nobody wants that. So it was like the idea was that was the only deterrent. It's like, you're going to kill me, I'm going to kill you too. So the fear was that, if you're the Soviet Union, what if the US launches a first strike at you and destroys your capability to strike back?
Yeah.
Right? So that they talked a lot about first strike capability and second strike capability. So if you're the US and the Soviet Union hits you first, do you have enough viable missiles left to hit the Soviet Union? And do they know that, so that they're convinced that they can't do a first strike? Because you have to convince your adversary, like, okay, you can take out all my cities and destroy all the silo-based ICBMs in the ground, but I've still got enough submarines wandering under the ocean, and you don't know where they are, that are capable of launching nuclear weapons, and their final order is going to be launch the missiles. So you had to convince your adversary not only that you had the nuclear missiles, that you are willing to use them, but that even if your adversary hit you first, you would have enough of a capability to hit them back and destroy them. That was the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. And so why this was so sensitive to miscalculation, as happened, as could have happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as happened with Abel Archer in 1983, was because, well, if you're the Soviet Union and you think that the Americans are about to launch a first strike on you, what do? Well, those missiles are going to reach Moscow and every other city in 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got 5 minutes to decide whether you're going to launch your missiles and hit them first.
Yeah,
this is the world that we lived in. It's
crazy.
Crazy now, but it was the reality. And we got out of it, although the risk of nuclear war never went away. But we're back not just to that, but to like, oh, and it's no big deal.
So crazy. And then I just, some of what you just said, I just want to note some of the hypocrisy here with the way that the current U.S. administration is looking at this. There's this wild hypocrisy, like for all the fretting over Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons, which I'm not even so sure he actually did that.
He never did. And this is important because every statement there was one kind of stupid statement from Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, who is like a million miles away from having control over any nuclear weapons in Russia. But from Putin, from the former President Medvedev, who's now the chair of the Security Council, or whatever that body is called in Russia, it was always a restatement of the Russian nuclear doctrine, which is well known and published, that nuclear weapons, basically the last resort, mutually assured destruction.
Right.
Like, it's if we're attacked with nuclear weapons, or the existence of Russia is threatened. That's their doctrine. And they were restating that doctrine in response to some of this careless talk from the West. And you have all these US and Western politicians and media twisting and distorting, treating this like it's a congressional primary race where you're taking, the social media posts of your opponent and twisting them and
right.
As if it's that level. And I think that, the previous generation, as awful as they were, wouldn't have done that because they understood the risk of miscalculation.
Yeah.
And I think it's possible that, the Russians understand who they're dealing with, that they're dealing with people who aren't serious and people who are working on this level of this as if this was a local, congressional primary, and that's how they treat truth. That's how they treat words. And so, but that's what they were doing. So, there is nowhere where they have suggested that they're going to use nuclear weapons offensively. And on the contrary, this maybe I'm kind of anticipating some of what you want to talk about, but I think that the talk of using tactical nuclear weapons is because some in the West see that as their only way to win the war in Ukraine against Russia, because Russia has such an overwhelming conventional military advantage, and Ukraine is really not going to be able to win this war, that there are some on the NATO side who fantasize about using so-called tactical nuclear weapons that can just take out whole Russian battalions at one go. But the problem with tactical nuclear weapons, not just that they're nuclear weapons, but that you can't control the escalation.
Right.
But that's where I think that's coming from, is they want to use it against Russia. So I think some of this talk is just carelessness and stupidity, but some of it is trying to lay the ground for saying, well, we had to do this because otherwise they were going to do it.
Well, so there has been changes in the language over when nuclear weapons on the Western on the U.S. side would be used. Like, they basically, the idea is that we might use these nuclear weapons in case of a non-nuclear attack, which might be to what you're talking about, is to justify using them in this case. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, even U.S. officials have said that Ukraine cannot win this war. They can continue to kill each other for probably years if the U.S. continues to just shower Ukraine with an endless stream of weapons. Of course, the war is going to continue, but that's different than winning.
That the problem is it may surprise people, but the stream of weapons is not endless. That's one of the issues, is that the West has run out of weapons to give Ukraine.
Well, I never thought the West could run out of weapons, but you do see them having to talk. They're constantly talking about, we can't go into our own stockpile. Like, they have an emergency stockpile.
They have. I've the past few days I've been reading up on, the best place to get this information is from, the weapons industry think tanks. So, for example, CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington War Industry think tank, and the RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is the British equivalent, and Russia is funded by the EU, the State Department, all the big weapons manufacturers and so on. And they put out these studies over the past few months. I mean, CSIS has a paper that came out in September that said that the Pentagon has gone into its stocks and given Ukraine $10 billion worth of US stocks. And this is artillery shells, missiles, anti-aircraft stuff, the HIMARS, all this ammunition and stuff. And this CSIS study says it will take the years for the United States to replace this. This isn't something where you can switch the production on and off. And the US hasn't been making a lot of this stuff for many years because the US didn't think that it was going to fight a huge land-based, grinding conventional war. All of their doctrine was, it's all about nimble, mobile forces, counterinsurgency forces, counterinsurgency like in Afghanistan, a war which, by the way, the United States lost. And you remember back in 2003, you may not remember actually, but I do remember, there was all this controversy, or like a mini controversy, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, when Donald Rumsfeld was the defense secretary, and there was some criticism that the US land forces he was sending in were too small, that it was going to be something like 100,000 troops to go in and occupy Iraq. Whereas a decade or so earlier, when the US invaded Iraq and liberated Kuwait from Iraqi forces the first time in 1991, the US assembled 500,000 troops in the Arabian Peninsula. So, a little bit more than a decade later, there was like, wait, what? You're only going to do this with 100,000 troops instead of 500,000? And Rumsfeld was, this is all about, it's modern warfare. It's all about smart bombs and technology and,
bombs.
Exactly. So you just don't need the same type of massive forces that you did even 10 years ago. And so what they've discovered now is that if you're fighting a grinding conventional land war that is about tanks and artillery, and there are estimates that I read one estimate, I think this was in CSIS or Russia, one of these papers, that the Russians were firing something like 30,000 artillery shells a day. And the Ukrainians were firing 5,000 a day, a fraction of what Russia was firing. But the United States produces in a month 5,000 artillery shells.
Yeah, you can't keep up with that. That's unsustainable.
You can't keep up with that. The Ukrainians are basically firing in a day what the US produces in a month, and it's still a fraction of what the Russians are firing. And then this is across the board. So the artillery shells, the 155 millimeter artillery shells, the HIMARS rockets, these famous high-tech US guided rockets. Apparently the stocks of and these are expensive things, they're like, I don't know, they cost millions of dollars per rocket. And the US only had a few hundred rockets, and they're gone basically, or they're down to what they're not willing to give up. So now apparently they've ordered, I think this system is made by Lockheed, they've ordered like some ridiculous number of them. But, they're not something you can turn out in a week or a month. And then the other thing is that the Ukrainians, that's a former Soviet army. So all their weaponry is, Soviet standard weaponry, basically the same weaponry as Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you're talking about the basic stuff like artillery and tanks and the basic anti-aircraft systems and that kind of stuff. And obviously, Russia is not going to sell weapons to Ukraine when it's fighting a war against Ukraine. So the US had to go to the arsenals of the former Soviet allies, the former Warsaw Pact countries like Poland and Slovakia and a few of the others. Apparently, Hungary has refused to give its weapons to Ukraine, but Poland has, and get all the Soviet tanks, the former Soviet tanks, and give them to Ukraine. Now, apparently, they don't have them. The same with the aircraft, the MiG aircraft and the Sukhoi aircraft and so on. And so what do? If you're the Ukrainian military, well, the Ukrainians are out there begging on Twitter and saying, we want US M1A1, the Abrams tanks. We want the German Leopard tanks. The problem is, driving a tank. I've never driven a tank. I mean, this is something
breaking news.
Yeah, but
you learned it here on Dispatches.
This is the kind of stuff like this. The stuff I used to read about as a teenager is finally like paying off. I used to read these books about World War II and about armaments and this kind of thing. When you're a teenage boy, sometimes, thank goodness I'm not interested in that anymore. But like,
it's
I didn't think, in 30 years time, I'm going to be on something called YouTube, and this knowledge is going to come in handy. But the thing is, those weapons are gone now, and driving a tank is not like driving a rental car. You can land at any airport and get in a rental car, and it doesn't really matter what brand of car it is. You know how to drive it.
Right.
You just look around. You need months of training, minimum, and you can't just in the middle of a war suddenly turn the Ukrainian army from a Soviet standard army into a NATO army, even though they had been doing that since 2014. It wasn't like a complete transformation. So the West is out of weapons. And this is, something you can learn from open sources, to basically the news media. Like open source is what they say to make it sound fancy. But it's like, it's openly said that the stocks are gone. Ukraine is out of weapons. There's no sign that Russia is even close to being out of weapons.
Right.
There's this constant fantasy they've been saying since March about, Russia's out of missiles. Russia's running out of missiles. Russia's running out. Since March, this story appears literally almost every day in the Western media. Today in Politico.eu, the European version of Politico, there's a story that Russia is running out of missiles. There was one like 2 days ago in some other publication, I've forgotten now. I think it was the New York Times or the Washington Post. There's no evidence that Russia is running out of missiles. This is wishful thinking. And the point is, this wishful thinking has become the only strategy to win the war, because it's like, Ukraine doesn't have enough weapons. NATO doesn't have enough weapons. Doesn't matter how much money you allocate for weapons if the weapons aren't there. And it's going to take you months if you are it would take months if you go into kind of like a World War II style transformation of your economy into a war economy. But nobody's doing that. Europe's not doing that. They can't even keep the lights on, and they can't even keep the heat on. Where are they going to turn their economies into a war economy to churn out artillery and tanks for Ukraine? They're not doing that. They're talking about, we need to do this in the distant future. They're not talking about doing it now. There's no sign Russia is running out. So what's NATO's strategy? It's, let's hope Russia runs out of missiles, and let's hope there's some kind of coup in Moscow.
Literally.
And let's write fan fiction about that and publish it every day in Politico and the New York Times and the Washington Post. So all of this is to say, Rania, that any sane and rational person would say, this war is lost for Ukraine. That's not a conclusion I'm sure that supporters of Ukraine like to hear. But, we said this back in February, this whole war. I mean, we got some things wrong for sure, but one thing we got right is that this didn't start in February 2022. It started in 2014, if not before. And the right thing to do before February, the right thing to do in February, and the right thing to do now is to negotiate an end to this horrible war, which is only going to kill more people, has already killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and which is, just think of the hubris when this started back in February, the euphoria on the side of the so-called Western leaders in Europe. We're going to win this war. This is finally our chance to smash Russia. We've been preparing the Ukrainians since 2014 to be our fist that is going to smash Russia in the face. And we're behind them. And we're going to implement our sanctions, which are going to turn the ruble into rubble and bring the Russian economy to its knees. And it just hasn't worked out that way. It is Europe that is on its knees. It's the US that is following not too far behind. And in the meantime, these psychopaths in Brussels and Washington insist they want to keep fighting until the last Ukrainian is dead.
Until they take us to possibly nuclear Armageddon.
And there's that too, as an added bonus. We might destroy the world too.
It's completely insane. And I do want to get back to the fact that Europe is in fact on its knees and the ways it's happening. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to comment on a video that you actually have been commenting quite a bit on Twitter. This, of course, is the comments that were made. I'm referring to the comments that were made by Joseph Borrell, who's basically like the foreign minister of the EU. And he was speaking, I think this was last week, and this is what he said about European countries versus the rest of the world.
Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It's the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. There's three things together. The rest of the world, and you know very well, Federica, is not exactly a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden. And the gardeners should take care of it. Should take care of the garden, but they will not protect the garden by walls, by building walls. A nice small garden surrounded by high walls in order to prevent the jungle coming in is not going to be a solution, because the jungle has a strong growth capacity and the wall will never be high enough in order to protect the garden. The gardeners have to go to the jungle. The Europeans has to be much more engaged with the rest of the world. Otherwise, the rest of the world will invade us.
I mean, wow. It's actually really shocking rhetoric. I mean, I was under the impression, Ali, that the Nazis lost in Europe after World War II. And that was really like Nazi rhetoric. What was your reaction? What is your reaction to these words by Joseph Borrell, who I should also state issued this very bizarre attempt at a non-apology apology, which you called out as being exactly that, not an apology. But what was your reaction to his statement?
Well, the first thing it reminded me of immediately was the words of Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister a few years ago. Barak was the prime minister in the 90s, a real war criminal, a real butcher of Palestinians and Lebanese people. And at one point, he called Israel a villa in the jungle. And at that time, that would just seemed like, the Israelis will say the things that nobody else will say openly, and now the same, almost verbatim, Borrell, who remember is supposedly a socialist, a Spanish socialist. So this is your left or center left in Europe, is talking in these. People have been calling it neo-colonialist, but there's nothing neo about it. It's old-fashioned, racist colonialism, white man's burden stuff that we civilized Europeans have to go out and tame the jungle, bring civilization to them, lest they come and pollute us and overtake, invade us. And it's got a huge dose of great replacement theory in it as well, which is supposedly, a far-right theory. But here it is coming from the mouth of the foreign minister of the European Union, an alleged socialist. And it's quite rightly provoked a huge backlash globally and disgust, But to me, it's like, there's nothing, this has always been the truth of the European Union and Europe more generally, but it was, as they call it, a mask-off moment. And for that, I'm very grateful for it, because I think the European Union skated by for a long time as this kind of kinder, gentler idea, there's the big bad Americans, but then there's the lovely Europeans, and they've always been, just kind of like the velvet glove on the fist of the American empire, or really maybe the sweat sock on the boot of the American empire, I think is a better metaphor for the Europeans. And it's also striking that, he talks about Europe in these terms. He says, it's the greatest combination of, political freedom, prosperity, institutions, everything works. Maybe there was a time since World War II when you could say that was true. That's leaving aside the fact that how did Europe get rich? It got rich by plunder and genocide. And, if you go on vacation in Europe and see all their lovely cathedrals and lovely museums and lovely, all the gold of Spain and Portugal that was plundered from the Americas, and, the splendors of England that come from imperial plunder and so on. I mean, even leaving that aside, okay, there was certainly a time when, there was stability, plenty, prosperity. Even that post-war stability and plenty was built on the cheap labor of people from the former colonies. In Britain, it was people from the Caribbean, people from South Asia, from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh. On continental Europe, it was people from in Germany, Turkey, in France, Algeria and Morocco, in Belgium and the Netherlands, Algeria and Morocco, and other countries and so on, Zaire. And then, of course, within Europe, remember, they didn't always treat each other as white people. We understand that, whiteness is a concept. It's not a biological reality. So even within Europe, there were these exploitive relationships of, the North exploiting people from the South, from Spain, from Portugal, from Italy. That's the reality of Europe. But let's take him at his word that there was a period of time, in recent history, in the previous few decades, when it was prosperous and there was political stability and working institutions and prosperity and so on. Look at Europe today. Where is the political freedom? There is more censorship in Europe than practically anywhere in the world. I don't think I could go to any country in Europe now practically and give a public lecture on Palestine without it being canceled. Or without the venue being denied. We've seen that so many times now in France, in Germany. There's no freedom of speech there in Germany or France. There's no political diversity. We've gotten to the point, if you think back to the period before 2003, before the US-led invasion of Iraq, it was in Europe that you heard a lot of the dissent. even from, France and Germany, you had leaders who were prepared to publicly differ with the United States. You had political parties, you had mass marches, millions of people coming out against the war. In Europe now, there is less political diversity and dissent than in the United States. That's shocking to me.
Yeah.
That Europe is more stifled and more uniform, and there's more McCarthyism there than there is than in the United States. Look at Germany. Germany's not a sovereign country, if it ever was. I mean,
none of them are. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because really, yeah.
But we hope. Look, Rania, as people of the jungle,
Right.
we hope to see the backwards people of the garden develop. All right. So Germany was defeated after the awful things that it did, during World War II. And it was occupied by the United States. It wasn't a sovereign country. But I would have liked to see the Germans develop by now, by 2022. I would have liked to see them develop to the point where they were capable of independence and sovereignty. Sadly, that clearly hasn't happened. Yeah, they're very good at some things. They're good at making cars and machine tools and all of that. They clearly have those kinds of skills. They're also good at making the kind of chemical weapons that they gave to Iraq in the 1980s to use against Iran. So Germany clearly has a lot of skills, but political independence isn't one of them. And that's very sad for me as one of the jungle people, hoping to have seen the Germans develop and grow to the point where they could govern themselves. But look what happened. It's obvious. I mean, unless you're just completely head in the clouds, I'm trying not to use rude words on a family show,
Appreciate that.
that the United States or one of its proxies bombed Nord Stream, the pipeline that is Germany's most important energy infrastructure project, crucial infrastructure for the German economy. It's obvious that the United States or one of its proxies, I've heard speculation about Poland or the British SAS or whatever, but they're the people who, it was the United States who said they would do it. It wasn't just Biden's senior moment when he said, we'll take out Nord Stream, because we have Victoria Nuland, who also said it clearly, that, we will bring Nord Stream to an end. So they have the intention, they have the motive, they have the capability. And then we had Blinken come out afterwards, the Secretary of State, and say, oh, this is a great opportunity.
He said it like 3 or 4 times, by the way, in the course of like a minute and 50 seconds.
So let's assume that the thing that is most likely that the United States did it, or one of its proxies did it with US help and support. What does that mean? It means that the United States attacked Germany.
Yeah.
It attacked, it carried out a military attack against its supposed ally. Okay. Nobody in Germany, no mainstream politician, no mainstream media is talking about this. The Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, is silent about it. Your country has just been attacked. Its biggest infrastructure project has been attacked. They're talking about shutting down 40% of German car production this winter. I read a study, a report the other day. It's one of these, financial forecasting firms. It said 40% of German automobile production could shut down in the next few months because of the energy crisis. We're talking about, deindustrialization of Germany, which is a process that's not reversible.
No, and it's so interesting that like the German capitalist class, like the industry leaders, are really not doing anything to push back against it, which shows you that level of like lack of sovereignty.
Absolutely. And it's so Europe is self-destructing for what? To fight a proxy war against Russia that is motivated by this Cold War ideology. I want to say these ancient hatreds, because what are they supporting? They're supporting this like 1930s, 1940s ideology in Ukraine that still glorifies Stepan Bandera, the the Hitler accomplice who helped commit genocide against Jews and Poles. That's what they're fighting for. That's their European values that they're prepared to destroy their economy for, freeze people to death in the winter. And
Ali, I want to just note, just to reinforce what you're saying, the UK's, which I still consider the UK being part of Europe, even though they are not part of the European Union, but of course they're Europe. The UK's national grid has warned that British households must prepare for blackouts between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. on really, really cold weekdays in January and February. And the BBC has prepared these like secret scripts that could be read on air if energy shortages cause blackouts or loss of gas supplies this winter. So it's the word self-destruction is like the perfect way to describe it, but please continue.
And for what though? But for the question is for what? You know, none of this was necessary. I mean, you know, we're not allowed to remember history. We're not allowed to think before like yesterday, but we know the story. We talked about it back in February or March when we, you know, I think we did our first discussion on Ukraine, that the history here is that at the end of the Cold War, you know, 1990, the agreement was no expansion of NATO, you know, and they kept expanding NATO, and Russia was very clear all along, you know, they rolled over for NATO expansion right up to their borders, basically in the Baltic republics. But they said Ukraine is a red line. There is absolutely no way. And when the US supported the coup in 2014, the neo-Nazi coup in Ukraine. Now remember, Crimea, even though it was part of Ukraine since the 1950s or whenever it was that Khrushchev transferred it to Ukraine, and they were all part of the Soviet Union at that time, so it didn't really matter. It's like, it would be like you transfer the UP, the Upper Peninsula, from Michigan to Wisconsin,
right?
Basically, you know, that's kind of what it was. I know there'd be like UP people who'd be really mad at me for saying it, but I'm just trying to give some
backlash
kind of context here. I mean, obviously, the history of Crimea is very different, but the point is that even though Crimea was part of Ukraine, the Russian Black Sea Fleet remained in Sevastopol, so it remained based in Crimea, even though it was part of Ukraine. And so in 2014, the Russians see a hostile American-backed neo-Nazi regime take over in Kiev, neo-Nazi supported regime. I don't want to say, you know, the whole character of the government was, but the neo-Nazis were the vanguard, you know, the Azovs and the Aidars and the C-14s and all those people were the vanguard of the American-backed coup. And now, you know, Crimea is basically, you know, you have the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is, from Russia's perspective, crucial to its security, basically surrounded by a hostile Ukraine. And the Russian demand was always that Ukraine remain neutral. And there was nothing wrong with that demand. And that would have been good for everyone, especially Ukraine. And so what exactly? There was, and for the people in Donbass, the largely Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian people of Donbass who didn't want to be dominated by Russian-hating, you know, ideologues, pro-Nazi ideologues who think they're descended from Vikings. You know, I mean, you could have come up with a political solution for that. And let me be very clear. I'm not saying that that this represents all people in Ukraine outside Donbass. Not at all. I'm talking about the people, the fanatics who the US allied with and who they put in power in Kiev and who took Ukraine down this path of destruction. And instead of putting a stop to it, there's, you know, a lost cause, essentially. They're going on with it. And it seems to me
they're also sabotaging diplomacy. Like they're going out of their way to make sure it continues.
Absolutely. And Russia and time, at least for the foreseeable future is not on Ukraine's side, it's on Russia's side. Because Russia can fight, they can fight a defensive war. They can just sit there with their massive artillery advantage and armor advantage and total air superiority. And any attempt at a Ukrainian counteroffensive, they can just smash it from the air and with artillery, which is what they've been doing, despite the kind of overhyped claims of Russia of Ukraine, retaking vast areas of land. They took basically, empty land that was of little strategic value. The Russians were able to withdraw to highly defensible lines, and they can wait until they want to mount another offensive. But actually, Russia has been sending signals that they're still open to diplomacy. They're still open to talking.
It's the U.S. that is sabotaged. It's the U.S. that refuses. They don't want talks. They just want to bleed the Russians. It's like the one track mind policy goal, no matter what.
It's a tragedy, Rania, that the people of the Garden just cannot get on with each other and just cannot see sense. And I get a lot of kind of pushback on social media, because I will say some of these things. Oh, you're Palestinian. You surely understand resistance. You surely understand, people are fighting for their rights. They're fighting for their country. I understand that. Of course I do. But you've never seen me say, when Israel is bombarding Gaza and the Palestinian resistance is fighting back with everything they've got, with their homemade rockets with real ingenuity, but still outmatched 1,000 to 1 by Israel. I never say, and no sensible person would say, oh, the Palestinians have to keep firing and keep firing until the last rocket, until the last Palestinian has been killed. We never say that. We say the resistance should use its capabilities as much as possible to deter Israel and to bring Israel to a ceasefire that will save as many lives as possible. You never say, oh, and nobody says, oh, like right now, I would never say Hamas or the resistance in Gaza should launch a first strike against Israel because they got to use every weapon they have against Israel. Nobody says that. Nobody says that.
Right.
So
I'm glad you're making this comparison, because I did want to make this point while I have you on. You have all of these U.S. officials, I'm going to show this tweet real quick by Linda Thomas Greenfield. You may have actually responded to it. A lot of people did, and it deserved it, not because maybe not because, I'm trying to say these places are in fact not Ukraine it's not really up to me, but she's saying in this tweet, all of these areas that Russia is occupying or is in and held these votes to become a part of Russia are actually in fact still Ukraine. And okay, fine. That's fine if you want to say that. I also don't really think it's right to, have people voting on referendums when there's actually a military occupation. I think Russia could have gone about that in other ways, but I'm not here to talk about that particular issue. What I want to note is that I want to bring it to Palestine for a moment. I don't think you're going to be surprised about this, Ali. I'm just going to keep talking as I try to bring this up on the screen. But basically, this is not from that long ago. Same administration. I'm not even showing you the Trump administration here. I'm showing you the Biden administration. I'm going to show you this video by Anthony Blinken. You'll be very familiar with it. Let's watch this. This is also for the audio listeners so they can hear this exchange.
The Trump administration, as you know, also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria back in 1967. Will your administration, the Biden administration, continue to see the Golan Heights as part of Israel?
Look, leaving aside the legalities of that question, as a practical matter, the Golan is very important to Israel's security. As long as Assad is in power in Syria, as long as Iran is present.
So, putting aside the legalities.
So sorry.
I mean, that,
shout out to Eugene and Brian on the Socialist program that I just stole that clip from them. But Ali, in the context of the rhetoric we're seeing around Ukraine, I mean, you and I feel like every time that we've talked this year, we've mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning so many times. The blatant double standards and hypocrisy. Because on the one hand, you have all this rhetoric from Western officials because it behooves them to suddenly care about sovereignty, whatever that means. It's very selective in Ukraine, about sovereignty, about autonomy over territory and against, annexation. And then you get to the issue of Palestine. And, you literally run an outlet that covers the issue of Palestine, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, Israel's atrocities against Palestine, which are completely, the guarantor of all those atrocities is the U.S. So when you see this rhetoric, I mean, it must be so aggravating. I know it's aggravating for me.
I mean, it is aggravating, but it's like, it's the rules-based international order. What are you going to do? It's like, we make the rules, we give the orders. That's, and it's like, it's not just, what Blinken said is like setting aside the legalities, Israel, as long as Assad is in power, as long as there are Iran-backed groups in Syria, then Israel is going to keep it, basically. And of course, others had made the point, they'd kind of taken Blinken's words and kind of just crossed out, Syria and Assad and said, when it comes to Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk and the other territories, well, as long as Zelensky is in power, as long as there are neo-Nazi-backed groups in Ukraine, as long as, the U.S. is standing behind them, then Russia is going to consider these territories vital for its security. Exactly the same logic applies. And, we've seen in recent days that Russia has been carrying out attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Zelensky tweeted the other day that 30% of the energy infrastructure had been knocked out, and it's causing blackouts in part of Ukraine, which is absolutely horrible for civilians, particularly as winter rapidly approaches. And, all the outrage from that, we saw, this is attacks on civilians and this is, outrageous. And it may well be, but this is a standard American tactic. The first thing they did in 1991 when they launched the war against Iraq was completely destroy Iraq's energy infrastructure, water infrastructure, sewage, bridges, roads, destroyed everything. In Yugoslavia in 1999, they bombed, NATO bombed the power plants in Yugoslavia, put Belgrade into darkness and other cities. Israel has done it countless times to Lebanon. It's the Israeli military doctrine. It's called the Dahia Doctrine, because Israel can't defeat Hezbollah, the main resistance group, militarily. They go after the civilian targets. So, how many times they've knocked out the power plants in Lebanon. They did the same in Gaza repeatedly in 2006, in 2014. So these are standard Western NATO tactics. And the difference is that if it was the United States, they would have done it from day one, and they would have done it much harder and faster and more completely. They would have knocked every light in Ukraine out.
Yeah.
So, we understand that this is all about power, and power in the world is shifting. And a lot of people talk about multipolarity as maybe a more favorable situation because maybe these powers will deter each other from doing these things. I don't know. That's maybe too much to hope for. Back during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States avoided a direct nuclear confrontation, but there were vicious proxy wars around the world that
killed millions of people.
Millions of people died in. The U.S. invasion of Vietnam,
Korea,
and Korea, and the destruction of Cambodia and Laos. I mean, it's not fashionable to say it, But, the Soviet Union was on the right side of almost every conflict. They were on the side of the anti-colonial liberation movements in Africa and around the world. So was East Germany. You could say, oh, well, they did it for their geopolitical reasons. That may well be true. Doesn't change the fact
Well, I mean, the
that they
U.S.
were on the
supported
side-
fascists around the world for its geopolitical ambitions. So, I mean, yeah.
Sure, but doesn't change the fact that, they were on the side of Nelson Mandela, not on the side of the white supremacists.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
doesn't, that's an inescapable fact that you can't just say, oh, well, they weren't sincere. Doesn't matter. They were on the right side.
Yeah. And speaking to, this is one of the last things I want to ask you about, but there's this mentality in US official discourse about, oh, like now that we're taking on Russia, like we shouldn't be just focused on Russia. We should also be taking on China and Iran at the same time. There's literally an article that just came out a couple days ago. This is the headline. Can the US take on China, Iran, and Russia all at once? It's not the first of its kind. I keep seeing this. There was one in the Washington Post a couple of months ago by Josh Rogan, who's like their resident neocon, saying something along the same lines, like, oh, it wasn't even a question he was asking. He was actually making a declarative statement about, yes, the US can take on Russia and China at the same time. So on the one hand, you do have what I think looks a lot like some sort of decline of the Western powers because of the US overextending itself, domestic issues in the US, the rise of other powerful countries that's taking place. At the same time, throughout all this, even though people in the US are aware that there's some sort of decline taking place, there's still this bizarre level of arrogance and superiority that we can just take on multiple nuclear armed powers at the same exact time. Let's provoke a war with China over Taiwan. I mean, it's just insanity. To what do you attribute this mentality that the United States, I don't want to say we, like I'm making these decisions, that the United States can take on all of these countries at the same time when we have like 70,000 bridges on the verge of collapsing inside America. And, I don't even know what the economy is going to look like in another 10 or 20 years, but it's not looking good.
I mean, that's a tough question. They're all, I mean, before we get to that, it's like, I don't claim to be a world expert in economics or history of every part of the world, but I just look at the basics, and that's and I also don't claim that I've always been right about everything, but I just look at the basics of this situation. Russia is the world's biggest country by landmass, not by population. It has massive natural resources, everything. I mean, it's got limitless oil, limitless gas. It's got, all the other raw commodities that the rest of the world needs. It is the world's number one wheat producer. I mean, along with Ukraine, they're like number one and number two. And it has a formidable military, which we're seeing now in Ukraine, unfortunately, because this war is absolutely horrible. But it's also fighting what it sees as an existential war.
So this is what I wanted to show. I wanted to show this tweet.
Then you have China, which is the world's most populous country. It has huge manufacturing and technological capability. It is they used to call Great Britain the workshop of the world. Today, China is the workshop of the world. You go to the stores in any country, and almost anything you pick up is made in China. And China can see what the West has done with Russia and Ukraine, and they can see the same patterns of behavior, of provocation with respect to Taiwan, with respect to Xinjiang, and they know that if Russia fails, they will be next. So China cannot afford to let Russia lose and will not. So Russia has vast resources, and it has China, which has vast resources as its strategic depth. These are countries that either have or produce everything they need.
Mm-hmm.
What about the United States? It's been completely deindustrialized.
Yeah.
Okay, it still has industry, but it's been largely deindustrialized. What about Europe? What does Europe produce? Okay, they produce nice sausages, and you can go there and you can have a lovely 5-course meal, and you know all that. And they make luxury leather goods.
Oh,
But what else does Europe produce?
You can't eat luxury leather goods. You
You
can't fuel your car.
I mean,
yeah.
the industrial heart of Europe is Germany, okay? And they're in the process. Germany is a formidable exporting power. They produce, the world's best machine tools and cars and, all this sort of thing. But they're in the process of deindustrializing it rapidly.
Yeah.
Okay? The US bombed the guarantee of Germany's competitiveness, which was the supply of relatively cheap gas from Russia. So if you look at this kind of in the long term, maybe I'm being naive, Russia and China can do without little Europe, which I've started to call far West Asia. It's like...
That's actually that's accurate. That's an accurate description.
Yeah, Chinese people and Russian people love to go on vacation in Europe. You go to any European capital in the summer, and there's Chinese tourists and Russian tourists. At least I haven't been there for a few years, but this was
there were
when I was last there. But they'll find other places to go. Mm-hmm. So what really do China and Russia need from Europe? And I think that's what the Russians realized, because post-Cold War, they had this love affair with Europe, and they're like, we want to be part of the club and we want to be normalized.
Right.
But they realize it's like, these people think they're Vikings and that the Slavs are not as good as them. and the Russians are finally getting that message. It's like, okay. So, they're building, this sort of eastward-looking alliance that, the heart of it is going to, as France and Germany were once the heart of the EU, the engine of the little diminishing EU, China and Russia look like they're going to be sort of the heart of this new global, formation or alliance that other countries are going to flock towards, because it's like you can trade with them. They're not going to sanction the hell out of you. They're not going to freeze all your assets. They're not, that's the other thing is like, you trade with the US is, you put your assets in the United States, they're going to sanction the heck out of you. They're going to confiscate everything. They're going to sanction all your official. It's like, it's too risky to do business with the so-called West, because they're going to
punish you if you don't abide by their every word.
Exactly. So I don't know. So when you look, to go back to Borrell and his comments, it's like about, we're the garden and everything is lovely in the garden. Out there is a jungle. I mean, it could be, this is just a theory, that these people are so steeped in their supremacist ideology and the notion that they really are the best, finest, cleverest, smartest people in the world, and that they can do no wrong, even though in his fake non-apology, Borrell did say, "Oh well, we're not always 100% perfect. We sometimes we're a little,
even,
but nobody's
even gods like us
exactly
make mistakes."
And I think that the ideology of America, so-called American exceptionalism, that I know you've talked about, and just the kind of the enforced ignorance of Americans, not because Americans aren't capable of being as smart as everyone else. Of course they can. But the disinvestment in public education, the cheapening of public discourse to the level of where everything is just the most stupid, childish culture war bullshit, doesn't produce societies. The state of so-called European, I mean, the idea of Europe that they still have is, oh, we've got all these smart people sitting around in cafes smoking gitanes and writing, philosophical treatises that are so clever. Where is this European intelligentsia? Where are they? Where are the people? Where are the great dissenters? Where are the European Noam Chomskys and Edward Saids and you could name many other people who today, where are they? I don't hear them.
I was just hoping it was a language barrier, but yeah, I don't think that's the
it's
problem.
It's not a language barrier. So I have a very bleak view of where Europe is heading, and that's the choice. I don't want to say that's the choice they've made, because there is no democracy in Europe. I mean, the EU is anti-democratic. You had that fantastic program a few months ago with I forget the name of the
Lapa Vistas.
Yes,
the former.
I actually after
after
watching your episode, you should link it in the
that's a good
down
idea.
below. But I actually bought his book after watching that show. I haven't read it. It's on my desk with the pile of other books I've bought after watching great discussions. But Europe is not. The EU is not a democracy, and these countries increasingly are not democracies. They are, like Germany, the biggest, most powerful country is basically an American puppet regime. Yeah. But let's just hope they don't drag the garden as it sinks into the swamp, doesn't drag the jungle down any more than it already has over the last 5 centuries.
That was very well put. I hope anybody inside the garden is watching and receives that message.
Are they allowed to? Are they allowed to?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't think we're banned in Europe, but who freaking knows? We're maybe banned by algorithm. But Ali, I really want to thank you for coming on, and I always love and appreciate everything that you have to say. I always learn so much hearing your takes on all of these things. Can you remind everybody where they can follow and support your work?
Yeah, and all I'll say is, I have a lot of fun when I come on your show. I just had a great time. I thought we were sitting around just like, it's like we were sitting around in a lovely European cafe having a chat. So I had a good time, but I hope that was actually useful for people. Yes, but I appreciate that. And you can find me on Twitter, which is where I'll be until I'm banned or algorithmed out of existence, at Ali Abunimah. And my brilliant colleagues and I publish all our work related to Palestine and related to broader regional issues that we didn't even get to this time.
Yeah.
I mean, we scratched the surface. But we had to talk about the European problem.
Yeah, there's so much more.
We have to solve the European problem. But you can find us at electronicintifada.net. But we have a fantastic podcast that is hosted. It's on YouTube by my colleagues Nora Barrows-Friedman and Asa Winstanley. Great discussions. You mentioned Katie Halper. We have an upcoming episode with Katie Halper that we talk about some of the censorship around Palestine, as you of course know, because you broke the story with Katie about her being fired by The Hill.
It's crazy.
And so she came on with us to talk about that and the broader issue of censorship about Palestine. So electronicintifada.net, and we're on all the social media.
And I'll link to the Electronic Intifada YouTube, because it's actually a video podcast.
It is, but it's also on SoundCloud and Apple and all those kinds of things. So you could
highly recommend.
If you can't find us, you're not trying. Is what I'm saying.
Well, Ali, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to doing this again relatively soon.
Likewise, thank you so much, Rania.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest Breakthrough News content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.